It was supposed to be just another cold Thursday night in the heart of Manhattan. The kind where city lights feel like lies, and the wind carries the scent of dreams that never made it. But for Elara, it was the night everything collapsed. Again, she stood outside a rundown diner gripping a rejection letter from yet another job she was overqualified for and undesired by. Her stomach empty, her wallet holding just $7, and her heart shattered beyond repair, when a black car pulled up without warning, sleek like money, tinted like secrets, and out stepped a man who didn't belong to this world, not hers anyway. With a coat that looked like it cost more than her father's entire life savings, and eyes so sharp they sliced through the night. He didn't speak at first, just stared at her, confused or curious or both, until he finally said, "I need someone to pretend to love me." Like it was normal. Like it was something you say between strangers on sidewalks, and when she laughed in disbelief, assuming it was a cruel joke from a bored rich man, he pulled out an envelope and pressed it into her hand, stacked with more money than she'd ever seen in her life. Trembling, she opened it, her breath hitching as the bills spilled out like possibility. Her eyes wide as disbelief clawed at her throat, and that's when he said the line that made everything feel real. Too real. 90 days. No strings, no questions. Just pretend you love me when the world is watching. And though every alarm in her soul screamed to run, to say no, her hands were already closing around the cash, her mind calculating how many debts she could wipe clean, how many meals she could finally afford, how many nights of sleep she could finally have without fear crawling over her skin like insects. And yet there was something else too. Something in his voice that didn't match his cold suit or designer shoes. Something broken. Something aching. Something that felt all too familiar, like she wasn't the only one pretending to hold herself together. And before she could talk herself out of it, her mouth whispered, "Fine. I'll do it." Not knowing those 4 words would flip her entire existence, because as he nodded and turned to walk away, her fingers still shaking around that thick envelope, she noticed the way his hand lingered at his side, clenched tight, like he had just sealed a deal with more than just cash. And when she followed him into that waiting car, she didn't realize it yet, but she wasn't walking into a transaction. She was walking into a war between truth and performance, wealth and poverty, love and survival, and somewhere deep in her gut. She already knew the part she was meant to play would come with consequences her tired soul wasn't prepared for, because behind his offer wasn't just a lonely man with too much money. It was a test, a trap, and maybe, just maybe, a second chance neither of them believed they deserved. And as the car pulled away from the curb, disappearing into a city that never forgives, Elara felt a tear roll down her cheek. Not from sadness, not from fear, but from something stranger. Hope, raw and terrifying, because for the first time in years, someone looked at her like she mattered, even if it was fake, even if it was dangerous, even if it was doomed. And in that moment, she had no idea that this temporary deal, sealed by a tear and signed in desperation, would lead her straight into the fire that would burn down every wall she'd ever built, and leave her standing at the center of a storm made of secrets, lies, inheritance, betrayal, and love that didn't ask for permission. Elara didn't come from comfort. She came from cracked ceilings and second-hand dreams, from a place where hope was rationed and disappointment was currency. Growing up in a worn-down apartment above a laundromat where the machines never stopped humming, and neither did her mother's worry, she learned early that life never handed out miracles, only lessons wrapped in pain. Her father had disappeared before she turned 8, a ghost in the form of a man who promised he'd be back after a pack of cigarettes and never returned, leaving her and her mother to learn the brutal economics of survival. By 14, Elara was juggling school and cleaning motel rooms to help pay the electric bill, and by 17, she'd buried her mother in a pine box. No one even came to mourn except her, carrying her grief in silence like an invisible backpack that never left her shoulders. With no family, no guidance, and no time for dreams, she hustled through life like a soldier without armor, waitressing double shifts, tutoring kids in back alleys for a few extra bucks, applying for internships she'd never get because her email still had at yahoo.com, and her resume didn't hide the fact she had no connections, no pedigree, no polish. But what she lacked in privilege, she made up for in grit. Yet even the hardest workers sometimes find themselves one missed rent away from collapse, and that was exactly where she was the night that car pulled up. A girl who had tried everything the right way, only to be punished by a system that never saw her, while somewhere across the city, in a penthouse that touched the sky, sat the man who'd offered her the strangest lifeline she'd ever been handed. His name was Dorian Hale, and to the outside world he was exactly what he appeared to be: wealthy, cold, powerful, untouchable. But beneath the Rolex and $5,000 suits lay a different truth, one he hadn't spoken aloud in years, because Dorian's empire was built not just on old money, but on old wounds, born into a dynasty where love was conditional, loyalty was transactional, and secrets were locked behind estate gates. He had been groomed since birth to take over the Hale legacy, a name that dripped with influence and backroom deals, where every holiday was a business meeting and every smile had a price tag. But Dorian's darkness wasn't just inherited, it was earned, because he had once believed in love too, once allowed himself to fall for a woman who didn't want his empire, just his soul, and when she was taken from him in a scandal that left headlines screaming and shareholders panicking, Dorian sealed off the part of him that could feel, replacing emotion with efficiency, vulnerability with vengeance, determined never to be played again, never to be blindsided, until his family threw him a threat wrapped in a demand: get engaged by the end of the fiscal quarter or risk losing control of the company to his cutthroat cousin, a man waiting like a vulture for him to slip. And that's when the idea struck. Not love, not marriage, just illusion, a performance to keep the sharks at bay. But finding the right woman wasn't easy, not when the ones he knew came with designer bags and designer expectations. And that's when he saw Elara on that sidewalk, alone, fragile, and fierce, her eyes sharp despite her pain, her defiance almost poetic, and something in him whispered, her. She won't fake it for fame. She won't want the crown. She'll just want the cash, and she'll walk away. No questions asked. And so he made the offer, thinking he could control it all, thinking it would be just 90 days of photo ops and rehearsed affection. But neither of them knew then that this simple business arrangement would unravel everything they believed about trust, power, and identity. Because while Elara thought she was hustling for rent money, and Dorian thought he was shielding his throne, what they were really doing was waking up ghosts neither had buried, and setting into motion a story where the hustler and the heir would learn that sometimes the biggest lie we tell the world is that we're okay. And the truth? The truth doesn't care about contracts or class. It only cares about what's real. And soon, their carefully crafted roles would start to bleed into something neither of them had the strength to stop. Elara stood at the edge of his world, dressed in a borrowed gown that still had the tag hidden beneath her long dark hair, feeling like an imposter in a museum where nothing belonged to her. Not the glittering chandeliers overhead, not the clinking of champagne glasses, not the marble floor beneath her heels that cost more than her monthly rent. Everything about the mansion screamed opulence, and yet all she could hear was the pounding of her own heart, trying to memorize every fork on the table, every forced smile, every, "Oh, I've heard so much about you," laced with judgment and curiosity. She was surrounded by people who had never skipped a meal, never waited for the bus in the rain, never had to calculate if they could afford a sick day. And they looked at her like she was an exhibit. Interesting, exotic, temporary. Dorian stood next to her with the same unreadable calm he always wore, his hand placed lightly on her back like a signal to the room. She's with me. But even that claim couldn't shield her from the weight of being out of place, because while Dorian knew how to glide through these crowds like a shadow, Elara moved like static. No matter how perfectly she smiled, they could all smell that she didn't belong. Like they could tell she didn't come from their kind of struggle. Elara had learned to hustle, not to network, and that difference was bleeding through her every gesture. She caught whispers trailing behind her, comments about her dress being off-season, subtle jabs masked in compliments, the kind of class warfare that didn't come with fists, but with fake smiles and sharp tongues. And what hurt wasn't that she didn't expect it. It was that Dorian didn't stop it, didn't say a word when his ex-fiancée approached with that practiced pout and glassy eyes, fawning over him while giving Elara the kind of look one reserves for a stain on a white carpet. Elara felt her stomach knot as Dorian played along, cool and collected, like it didn't matter, like this was all just part of the show. But Elara wasn't built for pretend, not like this. And as they walked the halls of his mansion later that night, rooms so vast they echoed even their silences, she couldn't help but feel the ache of everything she wasn't, the invisible barrier between them thickening. Dorian didn't notice at first, too busy arranging appearances and keeping up the illusion, thinking money could insulate them from reality. But the cracks were forming, subtle at first, a hesitation in her voice, the way she stopped reaching for his hand in public. The nights she started sleeping with her back to him even though they weren't really lovers. And then one evening, after a particularly brutal dinner with his board members where one of them laughed and said, "She's charming, Dorian, in a street art kind of way." She locked herself in the guest room and didn't come out for hours. She stared at the ceiling and wondered what the hell she was doing, pretending to be someone's fantasy when she wasn't even sure who she was anymore. Meanwhile, Dorian began to feel it too. Not the show falling apart, but the woman in front of him becoming more real than he ever intended. Because Elara didn't care about his wealth, didn't soften her opinions, didn't flatter him for favors. And that honesty, that raw defiance, both attracted him and terrified him. But the world they lived in didn't have space for a girl like her. Not in his father's estate, not in the pages of Forbes, not in the ruthless politics of money and legacy. And that truth slammed into her like a freight train the day she overheard one of Dorian's aunts whispering to another, "She's just a placeholder, sweetie. She'll be gone by the gala." That was the night Elara almost left, packing her bag quietly while Dorian was on a call, staring at herself in the bathroom mirror and realizing she'd been playing a role that wasn't even written for her. And for what? A paycheck? A lie? Or something deeper she wasn't ready to admit? Her hand trembled as she reached for the doorknob. But she stopped when she saw Dorian asleep on the couch outside the bedroom, still in his suit, still clutching the contract she had signed weeks ago like it meant something to him. And in that moment, something cracked. Not the contract, not the illusion, but something inside her. The understanding that despite all his armor, he was just as lost, just as broken. And maybe, just maybe, he needed her as much as she was starting to need him. But that didn't erase the truth that every day in his world chipped away at her sense of self, that no matter how close they stood, there were 1,000 silent rules reminding her of the line she could never cross. She didn't belong, and no dress or ring or photo op could fix that. She was just a girl from nowhere with calloused hands and a sharp tongue, and he was an heir built from privilege and protocol. And yet, in the middle of that quiet chaos, neither of them wanted to admit how badly they were starting to care. But caring doesn't cancel out class, and soon, the price of pretending would become higher than either of them expected. The mansion was quiet, the kind of rich silence that felt heavy instead of peaceful. And Elara sat on the velvet couch staring at the contract she had signed weeks ago. The same contract that had changed her life from a broke waitress dodging rent calls to a woman now sleeping under chandeliers worth more than her mother's life savings. It was supposed to be simple. Pretend to love Dorian for 6 months. Attend events. Play the doting girlfriend. Keep up the illusion while he closed a deal that required him to appear settled and emotionally stable. That was the deal. No emotions, no real intimacy, and most importantly, mutual boundaries. But tonight, after another bruising night among his elite circle who made her feel like furniture with a pulse, she needed to remind herself why she was here. She pulled out the envelope from her dresser, fingers trembling as she unfolded the fine print again, hoping to ground herself in the cold logic of the deal. But that's when she saw it. A page she hadn't noticed before, hidden within the folds, printed in the same elegant font, but with one critical clause that her tired eyes had missed. In the event of any unexpected death or incapacitation of Mr. Dorian Hale during the contract period, the recipient listed below shall inherit temporary control of Hale Private Holdings until further legal reassignment. Her breath caught in her throat, eyes widening as she scanned the line again and again, and there it was. Her name, Elara Mendez, listed in bold, with no legal advisor CC'd, no initial beside it, nothing to show she had agreed to this beyond her signature on the first page. A cold chill ran through her body as her mind spiraled. This wasn't just a fake relationship anymore. This was something bigger, something layered in legal traps and quiet trust she didn't understand. Why would Dorian give her that kind of control? Was it a mistake? A ploy? A test? Her first instinct was to confront him, but something told her to wait, to think, to remember that in his world, nothing was ever random. Everything was calculated, which meant this clause wasn't just an error. It was intentional. She thought back to the way he had looked at her when she first signed it. Serious. Almost soft. Like he knew something she didn't. And it suddenly made sense. The late-night calls he took behind closed doors. The meetings she wasn't invited to. The security checks that had recently doubled around the estate. Someone had threatened him. And this clause. This clause was a contingency plan. But why her? Why a stranger from a diner with chipped nails and zero corporate experience? Unless he trusted her more than he was letting on. Or worse, he didn't trust anyone else. She folded the paper slowly, heart hammering, mind flooded with new fears, new questions. This wasn't just about class anymore. This was about power, about legacy. And she had been thrust into the center of a chessboard without knowing how to play. Later that night, she watched Dorian through the glass walls of his office, pacing with his phone pressed to his ear, his jaw tight, his brows drawn in that way that meant something had gone wrong. And she realized he was hiding something, not just from the world, but from her too. The next morning, she asked him flatly about the clause. And for the first time since they met, Dorian hesitated, not out of guilt, but out of fear. His mask slipped just a little as he said, "It's better if you don't worry about that part." And that's when she knew. It wasn't just a safety net. It was protection. Maybe from his enemies. Maybe from his family. Or maybe from the truth itself. And as days passed, Elara started seeing things differently. The way his assistant flinched when a certain name came up. The way he always checked his car twice before stepping in. The way his father's lawyer had shown up unannounced last week asking odd questions. The puzzle pieces were forming a picture she hadn't signed up for, but now couldn't walk away from, because suddenly, pretending to be in love with Dorian wasn't the only act. She now had to pretend she didn't know she held power in her hands. Pretend she wasn't terrified that something bad was coming. And pretend she wasn't falling for a man who had just unknowingly placed his entire empire in her name. And as she stood on the balcony watching the sunrise over the manicured hills of a life that never felt hers, she whispered to herself, "What the hell have I gotten into?" Unaware that from this moment forward, every move she made would have consequences far beyond love. That in the shadows of money and deception, she was no longer just a paid actress. She was a wild card in a game she never asked to play. And the secret clause? It wasn't just a twist in a contract, it was the beginning of a war. Elara had memorized the way to carry herself in front of the cameras. The subtle arm loop through Dorian's, the soft tilt of her head when reporters asked about their love, the feigned laugh when he made a calculated joke about their first meeting. She had mastered the performance, not because she was trying to deceive the world, but because she had no choice. The deal was still intact, and the hidden clause now sat heavy in her heart like a secret too dangerous to say out loud. But somewhere between the gala nights and late-night debriefs, between the staged affection and whispered instructions, something had shifted. Dorian had started looking at her differently, not like an employee, not like a chess piece, but like a woman who had power, maybe even over him. It was in the way his hand lingered a second longer on her back as they posed for photographs, the way he started listening when she offered opinions on his press statements, the way his jaw relaxed when she entered the room like he didn't have to wear armor in front of her. And Elara, despite every red flag and rational voice screaming inside her, felt the weight of her walls cracking. She couldn't explain it. But the moments behind closed doors, where no one watched, where no press followed, felt more real than anything she'd ever known. And that scared her more than the claws, more than the threats she didn't fully understand. Because falling for him was never part of the plan. It was dangerous, foolish, especially when she knew this entire world could collapse in an instant. But emotions are rarely logical, and Dorian, despite his ice exterior, had begun letting his own guard fall. He showed her pieces of himself he didn't show anyone else, like the story about his mother's funeral, where not a single board member showed up, or the night he told her about the house in Italy he kept locked, untouched since his brother vanished 5 years ago. He wasn't just money and status and manipulation. He was grief, pride, pain, and complexity. And Elara saw all of it, which only made it harder to stay detached. The first real spark happened in the quietest moment. One late night in the wine cellar where they were hiding from a press ambush, both of them tipsy from champagne and tension, when Dorian whispered, "You're the first person who's ever made this life feel less like a prison." And Elara didn't know what to say, because she wanted to believe it wasn't just another line, another layer of the game, but something real, something raw. And in that silence, their eyes met. Not as employer and employee, not as billionaire and fake girlfriend, but as two broken people pretending not to care. And when he reached for her, just gently brushing her hand with his, the electricity was undeniable. It jolted something awake inside her, something soft and reckless. But as much as she craved that intimacy, she feared what it could cost, especially when she now held keys to his empire he hadn't even explained. The imbalance of power made everything messy, blurred, dangerous, and still, their bond deepened. Not because of the contract, but in spite of it. They had inside jokes now, routines that belonged to no one else. Even the staff started commenting on how natural they seemed, and Elara found herself smiling in moments when she wasn't supposed to, caught in thoughts of him even when he wasn't around. But love, true love, demands risk, and the problem with falling for Dorian Hale was that he still hadn't told her the truth. Not all of it. She knew that much. And it created a push-pull between them that burned hot and cold. One minute they were sharing stories under the stars. The next he was shutting her out with a single cold glance during a business call. Still, the more vulnerable he became, the more Elara couldn't help but lean in, because she saw beyond the suits and silk ties. She saw the man, the lonely guarded man who was trying not to drown in the legacy forced upon him. And somewhere in the middle of fake affection and real conversations, they crossed an invisible line. One night on the rooftop, when Dorian stood beside her, eyes on the city, and said, "If things were different, if I didn't have to be this person." And Elara, heart thudding, whispered, "Who would you be?" And he turned to her, slowly, as if the answer scared him. "Someone who could love you without ruining everything." And it broke something inside her, not because it was romantic, but because it was honest, painfully so. It wasn't a declaration. It was a confession. And from that moment on, nothing about the deal felt like pretend anymore. But the timing was cruel, because the closer they grew, the more danger crept into the edges of their world. Someone had started digging into Elara's past, asking questions, and Dorian's legal team had begun redacting files without telling her why. It was like walking through a storm with no umbrella, and Elara, now emotionally entangled in a man she was supposed to fool, had no idea how to protect herself anymore. Or worse, how to protect him. And while the world still saw them as a PR couple born out of strategy, behind the curtains, real love had begun to bloom in stolen glances and unspoken truths, and it terrified them both. Because in this world, love was a weakness, but pretending they didn't feel it was becoming impossible. The air in the room turned electric as the red live light blinked on, signaling that millions of viewers across the country were now watching what was supposed to be a simple charity gala interview. And Elara, dressed in a crimson gown that hugged her frame and made her look like a woman who belonged in Dorian Hale's world, sat beside him with rehearsed poise, her mind screaming with reminders to stay in character, to smile when needed, to say the lines they'd practiced. But everything felt different tonight. Like something was bubbling under the surface, something unscripted and raw. Dorian had been unusually quiet all evening, his jaw tight, his eyes flickering with something she couldn't read. And when the host leaned in with that million-dollar grin and said, "You two have taken the business world and the gossip columns by storm. Some say it's the greatest romance of the decade. So tell us, Dorian. Is she the one?" The room seemed to freeze. Elara's breath hitched, not because she wasn't prepared, but because Dorian hadn't briefed her on what to say if this came up. And for a man who always controlled the narrative, his silence was jarring. The host chuckled nervously to fill the gap, but Dorian didn't flinch, didn't blink. Instead, he turned slowly to Elara, looked at her like the world didn't exist outside that moment, and without warning, without a single word exchanged, he leaned forward and kissed her. Full, slow, and deliberate. The kind of kiss that didn't look like acting. The kind of kiss that carried weight, hunger, pain, and something dangerously close to truth. The cameras caught it all. The flash of vulnerability in Elara's wide eyes, the way her hand rose halfway to his chest and then fell, like she couldn't decide whether to push him away or pull him closer. And the way Dorian's hand cupped the side of her face like he was afraid of losing her right there on stage. Gasps echoed across the audience. The host sat stunned, and social media exploded in real time, hashtags trending within seconds. "War Dorian and Elara. Kiss of the year." But Elara's mind spun wildly, not just from the kiss itself, but from what it meant. Because this wasn't part of the deal, this wasn't rehearsed, this wasn't safe. And when he finally pulled back, looking at her like he'd just stepped off a cliff and hoped she'd catch him, she didn't know what to say, couldn't find her voice. And that silence became louder than the cheers erupting in the crowd. Later, behind closed doors, she stormed into his private lounge, the heavy doors slamming behind her. "What the hell was that?" she demanded, heart pounding. But Dorian didn't offer an apology, didn't deflect with charm. He just looked at her, eyes darker than she'd ever seen them, and whispered, "It wasn't part of the plan. But I meant it." And Elara froze, because somewhere deep down she'd known. She'd felt it in the way his fingers trembled against her skin, in the breath he stole from her lungs. But hearing it, admitting it, made the contract feel like a ticking bomb in her chest. "You can't mean it," she shot back, voice cracking. "This isn't real. We're not real." But Dorian stepped closer, eyes fierce and tired. "You think I don't know that? You think I haven't spent every day trying to remind myself this is a performance? But then you show up and smile at my board meetings like you've been running my company for years. You walk into my world like you've always belonged, and suddenly I'm not sure what's acting anymore." Elara shook her head, battling the whirlwind inside her. "You kissed me in front of the entire country." "Because I wanted to," he confessed, raw and reckless. "Because I was afraid if I didn't, I'd lose the one thing that's ever felt real." The silence stretched between them, filled with truths neither had dared say until now. And just as her walls began to crumble, the fallout began. The headlines twisted their story. The media called it a publicity stunt. Analysts speculated it was a power move to distract from a merger scandal brewing under Dorian's name. And worst of all, someone leaked a blurry image of the contract. Just enough to raise questions, just enough to cast doubt. Is their love real? Fake romance for financial gain? Who is Elara Kane, really? The public turned. The investors panicked. The sharks in Dorian's world began to circle. And in one impulsive kiss, everything changed. Not just for them, but for the empire he'd built. And the fragile trust between them cracked under pressure. Still, amidst the chaos, the truth lingered. He kissed her not for the cameras, not for the business, but because in that moment, he couldn't pretend anymore. And now, neither could she. The kiss had rewritten the rules of the game, and the price of love in this world was about to become very, very real. Just when Elara thought the worst of the storm had passed, just when she began to believe that maybe, just maybe, the feelings ignited by that kiss on national television could lead to something real, the past came crashing through the doors of Dorian's life with stilettos, venom, and a legal team ready for blood. Her name was Vivienne LaRue, And once upon a time, she wasn't just Dorian Hale's girlfriend. She was the woman everyone assumed would become his wife. Their faces once graced the covers of fashion magazines. They were the epitome of elite power couple goals until she disappeared from the public eye, following a scandal involving insider trading, whispers of manipulation, and a very hushed-up mental breakdown. But now she was back, and this time, she had a mission. Destroy Elara Kane and reclaim what she believed was hers. Vivian didn't just show up quietly either. She arrived in dramatic fashion, gate-crashing a corporate press conference where Dorian and Elara were meant to announce a new foundation together. Cameras rolling, media flashing, and right there, in front of the entire world, Vivian stepped forward in her icy white suit and spat out, "She's not in love with you, Dorian. She's in love with your bank account, and I can prove it." Gasps rippled through the room like thunder. Elara stood frozen while Dorian's expression turned stone cold, but Vivian didn't stop. She reached into her designer handbag, pulled out a thick, glossy packet, and handed it to the reporters before tossing another copy dramatically onto the podium. Inside was a leaked version of the contract Elara had signed, complete with the infamous clause, "No emotional involvement shall be pursued or expected by either party during this agreement." The room exploded into chaos. Questions, accusations, headlines were already writing themselves before the cameras even stopped rolling. Elara looked at Dorian, her eyes pleading. Not for forgiveness, but for trust. For him to remember what they'd built, what had grown between them outside the lines of that damned contract. But his face was unreadable, cold, calculated, exactly like the billionaire she had first met. And when security finally escorted Vivian out, smiling like a devil in couture, the damage was already done. Over the next few days, social media turned into a battlefield. Hashtags like Gold Digger Elara and Contract Love trended worldwide. Media outlets did exposés on Elara's past, twisting her hustle and resilience into stories of manipulation and social climbing. She was labeled a liar, a fake, a thief of love. While Dorian's silence only made things worse, investors began pulling out. Board members questioned his judgment. Tabloids unearthed Vivian's side of the story where she painted herself as the scorned woman betrayed by two frauds. Elara couldn't leave her apartment without cameras flashing in her face, strangers yelling insults, and worst of all, her heart breaking every second Dorian didn't come to her defense. Then came the final blow. Vivian filed a civil suit not just against Elara, but against Dorian too, claiming emotional and reputational damage, demanding a public apology and financial compensation. The news hit like a hammer, and that night, Elara finally confronted Dorian in his penthouse. "Why haven't you said anything? Why haven't you told them the truth?" she cried, voice raw. But Dorian was already spiraling under pressure, his empire crumbling, his board calling emergency meetings, and the woman he'd begun to fall for now looked like a costly mistake in everyone's eyes. "I'm trying to fix this," he snapped, "but every move I make just fuels the fire." "Then tell them the truth," Elara begged. "Tell them about us, about what changed." But Dorian, weighed down by years of keeping his emotions in vaults, by fear of vulnerability being used against him like it had with Vivian, shook his head. "I don't know what's real anymore." And with those 6 words, he didn't just break Elara's heart. He shattered every ounce of trust she'd been desperately holding on to. Tears burned down her cheeks as she whispered, "Then maybe we were never real to begin with," and walked out the door without looking back. As paparazzi flooded the streets outside, yelling questions and accusations, Elara walked through them like a ghost. The woman once known for surviving anything now visibly broken, while Dorian stood behind his glass windows, watching the only real thing in his life disappear into the night, unaware that Vivian wasn't done yet, that this was only the beginning of the war she was about to unleash, and if Elara and Dorian didn't figure out what they truly meant to each other soon, there might not be anything left to save. The night after the press conference had left Elara stripped of every illusion. She sat in her tiny apartment, lights off, curled on the couch where she once dreamed of turning her pain into something beautiful. But all that remained was silence, the kind that screamed, the kind that told her even love, even the kind born out of a lie, could be ripped away by the sharp claws of society and betrayal. Every news station played the clip of Vivian's public ambush on loop. Her face was everywhere, twisted in judgment. Strangers called her names. Online death threats poured in. Job offers vanished. Modeling gigs were pulled. And the nonprofit she'd been raising funds for had dropped her without explanation. Everything she had built, every fragile part of herself that had opened to the idea of belonging somewhere, even temporarily, was now mocked, shattered, vilified. But the worst part wasn't the world turning on her. It was Dorian Hale, the man who once looked at her like she was the only real thing in his carefully constructed lie of a life, standing in the storm and saying nothing, not even a whisper of defense, not even a look that told her he still saw her. And so, one cold morning just before sunrise, Elara packed her bags, what little she owned, and left a letter on his desk inside that palace of glass and secrets. It read only 3 sentences. "You hired me to pretend. I fell for you anyway. But I won't beg to be believed." Then she walked out of his life barefoot, metaphorically and almost literally, not even waiting for a response because deep down she already knew. If Dorian truly loved her, he wouldn't have stayed silent when the world spat on her name. And miles away, Dorian sat alone in his private office, holding the letter like it was made of fire, because it burned through his chest in a way that nothing else ever had. He wanted to chase her, scream her name, remind her of every glance that lingered too long, every silence between them that was louder than a heartbeat. But the walls inside him, the ones he'd built after Vivian, after his mother left, after his father's betrayal, were too thick, too frozen. He had spent years being a man who controlled everything, who calculated every risk, and loving Elara had become the most uncalculated risk of all. He let her walk away because fear told him she'd leave eventually anyway, that she was better off without his damaged love. And maybe, he thought, maybe by letting her go he was protecting her from the ruin he brought everywhere he went. But he didn't realize that letting go wasn't always noble. It could also be cowardice wrapped in elegance. Days passed, then weeks, and neither of them reached out. Elara disappeared into the background of a city that no longer saw her, waitressing again at a roadside diner just to survive, the irony bitter. Back to where she started, only this time with a heart bruised and hollow. She didn't cry anymore, because there were no tears left, only a numbness that wrapped around her like armor. And across the city, Dorian stood in boardrooms where no one questioned his silence, but everyone noticed his lifeless gaze. He signed papers, gave speeches, but in private, he sat for hours rewatching that kiss on national television. Not for the cameras, but the look in Elara's eyes that told him it had been real, and he'd thrown it all away, not because he didn't love her, but because he didn't believe he deserved her. One night, Vivian returned, smug and smugger, offering reconciliation, smiling like nothing ever happened, but Dorian turned to her and simply said, "Get out. And take your lies with you." Because even in the ruin, he knew one thing with certainty. Vivian was the storm, but Elara had been the calm he didn't know he needed. Still, he didn't chase her, didn't pick up the phone, didn't send a car, and that was his mistake. Thinking love would wait, thinking Elara would understand his silence as protection, when all she saw was abandonment, the final nail in a life already pierced with betrayal. And so they stayed apart, both aching, both waiting for the other to make the first move, until fate decided to intervene in the most unexpected way. Elara had always known how to wear masks, the confident smile at charity events, the poised responses during awkward interviews, the pretend sparkle when she modeled for brands that paid more for her looks than her voice. But after walking away from Dorian, after the scandal and the headlines and the silence that echoed louder than applause ever had, she realized something shattering. She had never been the one pretending, not really, because what she felt for him was real, terrifyingly real. And while she had agreed to act like she loved him, somewhere between the guarded laughs and late-night confessions, she had started to live that act with every fiber of her being, not for the contract, but for the man who looked like he had it all but smiled like he carried the weight of 1,000 regrets. She remembered every moment, how he'd silently bring her tea when she couldn't sleep, how his gaze softened whenever she touched his scarred hand, how he'd pause mid-sentence sometimes, like he wanted to say something honest but didn't know how. And now, in the quiet of her own world, far from glimmering chandeliers and luxury hotels. She saw her reflection for who she truly was. Not a hustler, not a con artist, but a woman who had loved with everything she had, even when it wasn't safe, even when it wasn't smart, even when he didn't say it back, and somewhere in between serving customers at the diner and walking home through streets that smelled like memories and midnight. She stopped feeling like she had failed, because she had loved truly, vulnerably, beautifully. And that was something Dorian never allowed himself to do. Not fully, because he had been pretending. From day one, pretending to be in control, pretending he didn't care, pretending that she hadn't cracked open the ice that shielded his heart. She wasn't the one pretending in front of cameras or at those stuffy galas. He was. And that realization didn't make her angry. It made her sad, because she saw now that Dorian wasn't just rich in money. He was bankrupt in trust, love, and faith in something deeper than power. But still, she didn't hate him. She pitied him, because he'd never know what it felt like to stand in front of someone with no makeup, no games, no lies, and say, "I'm scared, but I'm here." And that's exactly what she had done. Again and again, silently in gestures, in glances, in the way her hand would brush his when no one was watching, in the way her eyes begged him to say what his heart refused to. And now, as she sat writing in a weathered journal gifted by her mother long ago, she wrote a single sentence over and over. "I wasn't pretending." And somehow, those 3 words stitched together her broken edges, because they reminded her that love had lived in her chest even if it didn't survive in his. And miles away, in a penthouse that felt colder than ever, Dorian reread the contract, the one with the secret clause she'd never seen, the one that gave her 10% of his empire if she stayed long enough and the public believed in their love. And he realized how foolish it all had been, how he'd tried to buy an emotion that she gave freely, and how he'd punished her for doing what he hadn't dared believe, not in status or safety, but in him, the man beneath the money. And with that realization came a guilt that twisted inside his chest like a rope, tightening around every lie he'd told himself. He had hired her to act, but she had ended up teaching him what authenticity looked like. And now she was gone, somewhere out there living honestly while he stood in rooms full of fakes, surrounded by yes-men, haunted by the truth that she had been the only real thing in his world. And he let it slip through his hands because he was too afraid to let go of control. And suddenly, the idea of being a billionaire meant nothing, because all the power in the world couldn't replace the feeling of her fingers intertwined with his, her quiet strength beside him, her unspoken belief that he could be more than what he pretended to be. And as he stared out the window, snow starting to fall just like it had on the night of their fake engagement, he whispered into the silence, "You were never the one pretending." "I was." And he knew now he would never find peace until he made it right. Not for the contract, not for the press, not even for love, but for the woman who showed him that truth was not a risk, it was the reward. Elara had always known the value of hard work, of hustle, but the reality of owning something for herself, something real, something untouched by contracts and expectations, was a dream she had never allowed herself to dream until now. After walking away from Dorian, after everything that had happened, she had to rebuild. Not just her life, but her identity. She couldn't go back to being the woman who pretended, the one who smiled at cameras and accepted deals without questioning them, because now, everything felt different, clearer, more honest, and more hers. Starting a business was something she had toyed with for years, but had never dared pursue, because she thought it was safer to live in someone else's world, in someone else's dream. But as she stood in front of the small, dilapidated building that would soon be transformed into her cafe, something inside her clicked. This was hers. This was real. No contracts, no false love, no hidden clauses. It was all hers to mold and shape, from the quirky menus to the vintage coffee mugs she would pick up from the local thrift stores. Each decision felt like a stitch in her own personal quilt of redemption. And with each passing day, the work became more than just an escape. It became the rebirth of who she was meant to be. She started small, but her heart and soul were poured into every corner of that place. The recipes were simple, yet made with love. The kind of love that she had once given freely to someone who never understood what that meant. Slowly but surely, the business began to grow. Word of mouth spread. And soon, the little cafe became a spot where everyone from the hard-working moms to the lonely travelers found comfort. Elara poured herself into the work, her nights filled with late hours of paperwork, her mornings spent perfecting the coffee blends, each cup brewed with the memory of the countless ones she had shared with Dorian in the quiet of their secret moments. But this time, she was doing it for herself, not for someone else's validation or approval. And with every new customer, every loyal regular, she felt the weight of her old life lifting, as if with every sip of coffee, she was waking up to the woman she had always been, but had hidden away. There were challenges, of course. Finances, competition, the ever-present doubts that crept into her mind. But every setback fueled her determination, because she had learned something invaluable in those lonely months after leaving Dorian. She didn't need anyone else to define her worth. She could stand on her own, and for the first time, she saw her own reflection and liked the person staring back at her. But even in her success, even as the business blossomed and began to rival the big players, a part of her still wondered about Dorian. What was he doing now? Was he still pretending? Was he still stuck in the same cold, lonely world of masks and facades? But she refused to go back to him. She had to trust that she was enough. That her success, her journey, her life, was enough. Then came the day when he walked into her cafe, his presence still larger than life, his eyes still that mix of pain and something more. He stood there, silent for a long moment, before walking up to the counter, his voice quieter than she remembered. "I never thought you'd actually do it," he said, his voice rough, a mixture of admiration and regret. She looked at him, her heart caught in a storm of emotions. "You never thought I could?" she asked, her tone steady but sharp. He swallowed, a wisp of vulnerability passing through his guarded demeanor. "I never thought you would do it for yourself." She met his gaze, the air between them charged with all the unspoken history, the unfinished business of the past. But she didn't flinch. She didn't reach for him. She had spent too long trying to be someone else's idea of enough. Now, she was enough. She had built something of her own, and that was worth more than any fortune, any fake love, or any glossy world he could offer. "I did," she said, her voice firm, her eyes steady. "I did it for me, not for you, not for anyone else. Just for me." He stood there, his mouth opening as if he wanted to say something, but the words never came. He was too late. He had always been too late. Elara had moved on, not just from him, but from the version of herself that had been lost in the shadows of others. And in that moment, standing behind the counter of her own thriving business, she realized something profound. She was no longer just the woman who had loved him. She was Elara, the woman who had fought for herself and won. The woman who had built something from the ground up, with no help, no protection, no riches to fall back on. Just her own sweat, her own resilience, and her own dreams. And as she watched Dorian leave without a word, a small smile tugged at her lips. He would never understand. He would never understand what it meant to truly stand on your own, to build a life that was yours and yours alone. And that, in the end, was the greatest redemption of all. The world seemed to stand still for a moment as Elara stared at the document in her hands, the one that changed everything. Her eyes blurred, the words on the paper almost dancing before her. It couldn't be real. How could it be? But there it was. The legal transfer of ownership, the mansion, the sprawling estate that once belonged to Dorian's family, was now hers. The weight of the paper felt like 1,000 pounds, yet it somehow felt lighter than anything she had ever held. It was a twist she had never seen coming. She had walked away from Dorian with nothing more than the strength to rebuild herself. She had built her business from the ground up, slowly and surely, with her own hands and heart. And yet, here she was, holding the keys to a life she had never wanted, one that had always been surrounded by wealth, privilege, and the false promises of love. She hadn't asked for this. The mansion wasn't part of her plans. She had worked for everything she had, and the idea of stepping back into that world felt like stepping back into a life she had fought so hard to escape. It felt wrong, like something she could never truly belong to. She remembered the first time she had set foot in that mansion. The cold, grand hallways that whispered of wealth and secrets, the faceless people who walked past her without a second glance. It had always been a place of shadows, a place where love had been a game, a commodity. And now, the mansion was hers. The legal document was signed, the transfer complete. But what did it mean? What was she supposed to do with it? It wasn't hers in the way her business had been, something she had created with her own sweat, her own efforts. This mansion felt like a prize she never wanted to win, a relic of a life she was glad to leave behind. She could hear the echo of Dorian's words in her mind, his voice soft but laced with the faintest trace of bitterness. "You'll need it," he had said when he handed her the legal papers, his eyes filled with something she couldn't quite read. "It's yours now, Elara. You earned it." Earned it? She had never asked for it. The mansion had always been a symbol of everything she despised: entitlement, manipulation, and the kind of cold love that demanded sacrifice for comfort. But here she was, standing at the crossroads of a life she had never imagined for herself. The mansion was more than just a building. It was a reminder of everything she had fought against, everything she had worked to leave behind. But it was also a reminder of something else, the fact that she had overcome so much to get here. It wasn't about the wealth or the mansion. It was about her journey, her growth, and the person she had become. A person who was no longer willing to live in anyone's shadow, who was strong enough to claim what was hers, regardless of how complicated it seemed. But there was still a sense of unease that lingered in her chest. Was she really ready to take ownership of this life? Could she ever truly belong to this world, the one that had always seemed so far removed from her own? She had spent so long fighting for independence, for the right to define herself, and now here she was, faced with a decision that could alter everything. The mansion wasn't just a building. It was a symbol, a mirror to her past, and maybe even a glimpse into her future. She had worked so hard to make her own way, to build something real for herself. But what if accepting the mansion meant returning to that life of excess, of manipulation, of pretending to be someone she wasn't? She walked through the grand hallways, each step echoing in the silence that surrounded her. The mansion was beautiful, there was no denying that. The marble floors gleamed under the soft light, the chandeliers sparkled like stars in the dimness, but it all felt cold and distant. Everything about it screamed of a world that wasn't hers, a world she had never wanted. As she walked through the mansion, memories of Dorian flooded her mind. She could almost hear his voice, his promises, his touch. The man she had once loved, the man who had promised her everything and delivered nothing, the man who had never truly seen her for who she was. She had loved him, but love had never been enough in his world. It had been about power, about control, about ownership. And now, the mansion was hers. But she didn't need it. She didn't need him. She didn't need the wealth or the opulence or the facade of a perfect life. She had built something better, something real. She had built a life from the ground up, something she could call her own. She didn't need a mansion to define her. What she had done for herself, with her own hands, was far more valuable than anything that mansion could ever offer. She sat down in the grand living room, the weight of the decision pressing heavily on her chest. The mansion was hers, but she didn't want it. She didn't want the life it represented. She didn't want the memories of a love that had been more illusion than reality. She had found her own way, her own purpose, and the mansion would not change that. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the expansive grounds. The garden was overgrown, the fountain stagnant, but there was beauty in the decay, in the brokenness. It was like her life, her past, beautiful in its own way, but not the life she wanted to live anymore. She could sell the mansion, she could donate it, or she could leave it behind. But she knew one thing for sure. She would never go back to the world it represented. She had her own life now, her own dreams, and she was more than capable of creating a future that was truly hers. As she made the decision, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. The mansion no longer had a hold on her. She was free. She was no longer a prisoner of the past, no longer bound by the expectations of a life that never truly fit her. The mansion was a gift, but it was a gift she didn't need. And in that moment, she knew she had made the right choice. She would sell the mansion, use the money to expand her business, and continue building the life she had fought so hard to create. This was her future. This was her life. The courtroom was eerily quiet, every inch of space charged with tension as Elara stepped inside, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never imagined herself here, standing at the center of this battle. But today was different. Today, she wasn't just fighting for what was rightfully hers. She was fighting for her dignity, her future, and for the closure she had long deserved. As she gazed across the room, her eyes met Dorian's, cold, calculating, yet somehow filled with a hint of remorse. The man she had once trusted, the man who had played with her heart and treated her as a mere pawn in his world of wealth and manipulation, now sat there, surrounded by his high-powered lawyers, as if he could still control the situation. But today, the power had shifted. She wasn't the same woman who had walked away from him months ago. She had grown stronger and more confident, and she knew that this was the moment she had been waiting for. Her hand gripped the papers tightly in her hand, the evidence that would change everything. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation, the judge's gavel echoing through the air as the trial began. Elara stood tall, her mind clear and focused. Dorian had tried everything to avoid this confrontation, to buy her silence, to make her believe she was nothing. But today, in front of everyone who had once looked down on her, she was going to prove that she was far more than the woman he had once deceived. The tension between them was palpable, like a storm waiting to break. Elara's lawyer spoke with authority, detailing the breach of contract, the lies, and the manipulation. Dorian's defense team tried to twist the narrative, portraying her as a gold digger, a woman who had used him for his wealth. But Elara wasn't just a woman. She was a force, and she wasn't going to let them dictate her story anymore. As the judge turned to her, his eyes soft but stern, she took a deep breath and stood up, her voice steady but filled with undeniable strength. "I never asked for any of this," she began, her words carrying through the courtroom like a wave crashing against a wall. "I never asked for the money, the mansion, or the contract. What I wanted was to be treated with respect, to build my own life, to stand on my own 2 feet. She paused, locking eyes with Dorian, feeling the weight of everything she had been through. "But you took that away from me. You made me feel small, insignificant, and like my worth was tied to what I could give you. You thought that because you were rich, because you had everything, you could control me. But today, I'm here to tell you that I'm not your puppet, not your project, and not your property. I am my own person, and I've built my life with my own hands." Her voice wavered slightly, but the determination in her words only grew stronger. "This court is here to decide whether or not you owe me what you promised. But more than that, it's about whether or not you can ever truly understand what it means to respect someone. You think you can control everything with your money, but you can't control love. You can't control me anymore." The courtroom was silent as Elara finished speaking, the air thick with the weight of her declaration. She had come here to confront Dorian, not just for the financial restitution, but for herself, for the woman she had become. The jury and the judge sat in stunned silence, some clearly moved by her words, others uncertain of what would happen next. Dorian shifted in his seat, his face a mask of frustration. He had never expected her to fight back like this, had never imagined she would expose the truth of their relationship in such a public, raw way. His eyes flitted to his lawyers, who looked equally rattled, and for the first time in months, Elara saw a flicker of doubt in his gaze. "I was wrong," Dorian finally spoke, his voice softer than it had ever been, the arrogance drained from him. "I used you. I didn't understand what I was doing until it was too late. You deserved better." His words hung in the air, but Elara wasn't sure if they were truly sincere or just an attempt to salvage his reputation. She had heard those words before, in different forms, but now they felt empty. She wasn't the same woman who had fallen for his charm, for his promises. The judge interrupted the moment, his voice cutting through the tension. "I will review the case and issue my ruling shortly," he said, his tone authoritative. Elara nodded, her eyes still locked on Dorian, her heart racing but filled with a sense of finality. She had faced her past, had confronted the man who had once held so much power over her, and now, no matter what the outcome of the trial was, she knew she had won. This was no longer about the money, the mansion, or the contract. It was about reclaiming her own story, her own future. She had come to realize that love, real love, wasn't about ownership or control. It was about equality, respect, and mutual growth. And for the first time in her life, she was free. The courtroom buzzed as the judge adjourned for a brief recess. Elara walked out of the room, her steps firm and confident. She didn't need Dorian's approval anymore. She didn't need his fortune or his title. She had her own future to shape and her own path to walk, and she was ready to embrace it. Outside, the world awaited her, and she knew that whatever came next, she was ready to face it. This was her moment, and nothing could take it away from her. The courtroom was electric with anticipation as Elara stood at the center of it all. The grand reveal was moments away, and she could feel the weight of the years, the pain, and the truth all leading to this one pivotal moment. She had never sought out the fortune, never asked for the mansion or the wealth that had been promised to her under false pretenses. But as the judge read aloud the final piece of the puzzle, everything fell into place. The papers, the hidden clause, and the truth about the inheritance. Everything she had been unknowingly part of had been hers all along. Dorian's face went pale as the realization hit him. The smug arrogance he had once carried was now replaced with stunned disbelief. The fortune, the mansion, the company. Elara's name had always been attached to it. The deal she had entered into wasn't to save him or help him. It was her inheritance, her birthright, masked under the guise of a contract. She was no mere pawn in his game. She had been the queen all along. As the judge's gavel struck the final blow, Elara's heart raced, but not from fear. It was a surge of strength, of empowerment, as she took in the enormity of what had just transpired. The woman who had once been invisible, dismissed, and manipulated, was now the rightful owner of it all. The room fell silent as Dorian's gaze locked with hers, his eyes filled with a mix of guilt, shame, and surprise. He had believed, all along, that he had been the one controlling the narrative, that he could buy his way out of anything. But now, the truth was undeniable. The fortune had never been his to begin with, it had always been hers. As Elara turned away from the court and stepped out into the daylight, a new sense of freedom washed over her. She had not just won a court case or reclaimed wealth. She had reclaimed her identity, her strength, and her future. No longer would she be defined by the lies others told about her. No longer would she be held down by the shadows of deceit. The world was hers to shape, and for the first time in her life, Elara knew she was ready to take it. The mansion, the company, the money, they were mere symbols of her journey, but they no longer mattered. What mattered was the power she had discovered within herself, the power to rise above, to claim her place, and to build her own destiny. She was no longer the woman who had pretended to love for a paycheck. She was the woman who had always deserved it all, and now everyone knew it. As she left the courtroom, her steps were strong, deliberate, and filled with purpose. She didn't need anyone's approval or validation. The world would soon know her for who she truly was, a woman who had faced the truth, fought for herself, and emerged victorious. The fortune had always been hers, not because of a man's promises, but because she had earned it every step of the way. And now, she would make it her own. The tension in the air was palpable as Elara stood before Dorian, their eyes locked in a moment of raw, unspoken emotion. The courtroom had long been cleared, the battle for wealth and power now a distant memory. But in this final moment, it wasn't about the fortune, the mansion, or the title she had claimed. It was about the two of them, standing on opposite sides of everything that had come before. Dorian, the man who had once seen her as nothing more than a transaction, now stood before her with a look of deep regret and something far more profound: love. His voice trembled as he spoke, breaking the silence that had settled between them. Elara, I'd pay any price for you again. To have you by my side, to fight for you like I should have from the start. His words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of everything he had failed to see until now. For so long, he had believed that power and control could dictate the course of his life, that money and manipulation could make up for the absence of true connection. But now, standing before her, he realized that none of it meant anything if it wasn't for her. His world had been hollow without her, and no amount of wealth could ever fill the void she had filled with her strength, her intelligence, and her heart. Elara, her heart heavy with the memories of the pain he had caused, took a moment to process his words. She had loved him once, or at least she had thought she did. But her journey had brought her to a place of self-discovery, of understanding that love wasn't about sacrifice or submission. It was about standing side by side, equal, unshaken by the external forces that tried to tear them apart. She had seen the man Dorian could be, the man who had learned finally to cherish and respect her, not for what she could do for him, but for who she was. A tear fell from her eye, not of sadness, but of recognition of how far they both had come. She had won more than just material wealth. She had found her own worth, her own strength. And now, in this moment, with Dorian at her side, she realized that she could have it all: love, power, and respect. But this love, this connection, was no longer something she needed to earn. It was something they both had to choose, together. With a steady breath, she spoke, her voice calm, yet filled with emotion. I don't need you to pay any price for me. What I need is for you to stand with me as equals, as partners. The price you've already paid has been more than enough. Dorian, tears welling in his eyes, nodded silently. He understood. The years of manipulation, of trying to control everything, had led him here. Broken, but enlightened. He was ready to pay whatever it took to rebuild their relationship, to stand beside her as a man deserving of her love. In that moment, the weight of their past lifted, and the future stretched before them, uncertain but filled with endless possibilities. Together, they would write their own story, free from the constraints of wealth, power, and pretensions. It was a new beginning, one that didn't need any price tag, only mutual respect, trust, and love. As they embraced, the world around them faded away, leaving just the two of them. Two souls who had fought their battles, paid their prices, and found their way back to each other. As Elara and Dorian stood in the soft glow of the evening, their world transformed into something unrecognizable from where they had begun. The battles they had fought, the painful revelations, the journey that had brought them together, all of it now seemed like a distant memory, overshadowed by the love and respect they had finally found in each other. Their story had gone beyond just the exchange of money or power, beyond the contracts and the superficial facades that had once defined their lives. In this moment, standing hand in hand, they were no longer defined by wealth or status, but by the trust they had built, the sacrifices they had made, and the love that had emerged from the chaos. But as the camera panned out, Elara's voice broke the silence, a question hanging in the air, both a challenge and a reflection of everything they had overcome. Would you love someone if money was involved? Her words echoed in the quiet space between them, stirring something deep within. Would anyone? It was a question that cut through the heart of every relationship, one that forced a reckoning with the true meaning of love. Could love exist in a world where money was the driving force? Or was it merely a tool, a test of who we really are when we're stripped of all illusions? The question lingered as the scene slowly faded to black, leaving the audience to reflect on their own experiences and beliefs. The story had come to its conclusion, but the question remained, stirring emotions, challenging perspectives, and reminding everyone that love, in its truest form, was priceless, and no amount of wealth could ever change that. As the screen went dark, the final message was clear. True love isn't about what you have, it's about who you are and who you're willing to become for someone else.